humanities, the arts, and the neurosciences, and anybody involved with any of those things. So we're excited tonight to have some folks from the arts, as well as from the neurosciences, and kind of starting a discussion. And we'll be really interested to see where things go tonight. We have a good sized team at this point, all kind of working on this, working on finding programming and kind of leading this initiative, but we're always looking for more collaborators. So if anybody is interested in joining our network, please feel free to reach out. We do have several kind of places that you can visit to learn more about us. Typically, we have a monthly lecture like this, and then also kind of experiential booster sessions on like a semi-monthly basis. All these are typically recorded on our YouTube channel, which you can feel free to check out. And then we have several social media options as well, and a newsletter that goes out, usually like monthly, bi-monthly, to kind of keep people up to date on what's going on and any programming we might have. And we have this amazing new website that Rita, one of our team, made. But please check it out. There's the QR codes on the screen to take a look at things. So today, I have been super excited for this particular instance for a really long time. One of our goals in founding the Neurohumanities Network was to really, as I mentioned, provide an intersection between the arts, humanities, and the neurosciences. And we feel a really huge part of that is creating a space where people can talk who might not otherwise intersect with each other. And we really think that a lot of innovation is created from that, and a lot of kind of the best ideas come from when you're exposed to ideas that you might not be super familiar with, or people's backgrounds who you're not super familiar with. So this is actually our first instance of having a panel discussion. Typically, we just have one person speaking these seminars, but we have kind of a collaboration between the Manhattan School of Music and then Johns Hopkins tonight. So really, really excited. I'll just introduce our speakers super briefly, but I don't want to take too much time. The format for tonight is that we'll kind of have two different sets of lectures from the Manhattan School of Music team and then from Alex. And then we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes at the end to sort of have discussion and conversation. But feel free to type any questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll kind of try and address them at the end as well. So just to introduce everyone briefly, Dr. Pantelyat is an associate professor of neurology at Hopkins who focuses on atypical Parkinson's. He's also a talented violinist. And one of his goals is making music and rhythm an integral part of treating age-related illnesses. He's done numerous studies showing that interventions such as singing can improve mood, speech, and swallowing in patients with Parkinson's disease, and has recent work looking at patients walking in a march-like beat with atypical PD resulted in improved gait and balance, which carried over even after the music stopped. He's now working with industry to develop a wearable device, which is a sensor on the shoe linked to a phone app with a playlist of favorite tunes that will adjust the music's tempo to the wearer's gait, to help address gait issues and walking, as well as other neurodegenerative aging-related issues. So really, really super cool, super innovative stuff. And then these other folks, Dr. Fueting and Thomas Palmer, are both from the Manhattan School of Music. So Dr. Fueting studied composition piano at the Hochschule, excuse my terrible German, Dr. Fueting and everyone else, but studied at the Hochschule für Musik, Kamera von Webern in Dresden at Rice, and then also at the Manhattan School of Music and at Seoul National University. He joined the theory faculty of the Manhattan School of Music in 2000, and then 5 years later became a member of the composition faculty and was appointed chair of the theory department. In 2020, he was also appointed chair of the composition department and is currently serving as dean of academic core and head of composition. He's taught vocal accompanying in the Conservatory of Music and Theater in Rostock, Germany, and appears as guest faculty and lecturer at universities and conservatories all over the place, including China, Colombia, Germany, Italy, Russia, South Korea, and the United States. As a composer, he's received numerous prizes, awards, scholarship grants, and commissions. His music has been featured all across the world. Most of his recordings have been released on the New Focus label in New York. He's collaborated with musicians all across the board, with a particular interest in vocal ensembles and ensembles performing on period instruments. He has an opera on the life of the mystic nun Mechthild von Magdeburg, that premiered at the reopening of the concert hall in Magdeburg, Germany in 2022. And he's a composer in residence at the Schaff's House, Magdeburg, during the 2023-2024 season. Thomas Palmer is also a composer and performer based in New York City, whose works have been performed by ensembles across the East Coast. He's received several awards, including the John Lucretia Herr Award for Composition, the Arthur M. Fraser Award. He was interviewed in 2019 on South Carolina NPR and is published by Murphy Music Press. He's a big advocate for new music, and he maintains a full schedule of projects and commissions. He received his BM in composition from University of South Carolina and studies under Dr. Fueting at the Manhattan School of Music in New York. As some of you may have guessed, he is also my brother. We get frequent comparisons, which is a compliment to me and probably not to him. But really excited to hear everything from them tonight. So please take it away.
And we'll start with Alex, and then we'll go with Reiko.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to see many of you virtually and see a lot of people are connecting. Thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. As a result of that introduction, I'm going to throw in a couple more slides to address some of the things that you so deftly added. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and just really want to show a couple of slides to frame the discussion and make sure that we have the time for interactive discussion and questions. So what I thought I would do is delve right in and talk a bit about the neurophysiological responses of the body and particularly the brain to music, whether we're hearing music or making music, singing, playing a musical instrument, and so on. And just confirming you could see my slides advancing, right?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So in terms of the question, how does music impact us? Broadly speaking, whenever a stimulus is applied, there is going to be increased cerebral activity. And what I mean by that is that the brain is electric, it fires, and it's associated with increased regional blood flow to the areas of the brain that are active in response to a certain stimulus. So we're thinking about music here. And many studies have demonstrated that listening to music, but also making music, can powerfully impact the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. This axis involves several regions, starting in the brain, but ultimately, heading to the adrenal cortex, and leads to cortisol release. So the stress hormone that I think most of everyone has heard about. And multiple studies have indicated that cortisol levels can be impacted by music. So part of the equation when we're talking about how music affects us as human beings, it's through effects on cortisol. And I'm going to sound this note of caution right now because I get this question a lot when I talk about music in the brain. Is a certain type of music going to heal us better? Or, is there a particular music, say Mozart, as a panacea? And the answer is no. And that's not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. On a cultural level, a lot more work needs to be done studying non-Western music, non-classical music. That's kind of where things have mostly focused until recently. I personally, as a trained violinist, find that classical music relaxes me. But for me, it's not going to be every kind of music, right? The same composer could have music that upregulates the HPA axis and leads to increased cortisol release. And other types of music by the same composer are going to reduce cortisol levels. And studies have certainly demonstrated this. The other point of this is when I make the central point of one size does not fit all is I'll give you this example, which I'll follow up in the next slide as well. Imagine two people are hearing the same song. They both got married around the same time. And this song was the song that they chose as their first dance song with their loved one. And now imagine they're hearing the same song 10 years later, and one person remains happily married to that same partner, and the other person went through a bitter divorce 7 years in. That leads to hypotheses that are interesting for us to think about, but I would be willing to bet that cortisol levels will spike for the person who went through the bitter divorce hearing that song 10 years in, depending on the context, of course. And then that same song is going to probably affect cortisol in a very different measurable way for the other person. So hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, part of the equation. Overall, the effects here are on the mediation of the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system regulates a lot of things in our body, including cardiovascular responses. So blood pressure, and heart rate variability. And again, depending on the type of musical stimulus, you could have activation of the sympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system, so-called fight or flight response. And other types of musical stimuli could impact the parasympathetic nervous system with a down regulation of heart rate, blood pressure, the rest and digest system, as we typically refer to it colloquially. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide, and I'll be nearly done. This is kind of an amalgam of what studies have shown in the last 25 years or so. This is now, an 8-year-old review from Lancet Neurology by Stevenin and colleagues. And I really like this slide because it makes several points. One point, overarching point, is that there's something for everyone potentially. If you're looking at the different brain networks that are impacted by just hearing music, and especially if you're playing music or singing, you have activation of much of the main regions of the brain simultaneously. So therein lies the promise for music-based interventions, especially if we recognize that one size does not fit all, and that what we really need is precision music medicine. We need a tailored, individualized series of approaches, in part on a genetic basis, but also on a cultural basis, to actually select the kind of musical stimuli that will lead to the preferred responses, physiological responses in the brain and body we're trying to elicit. At the same time, of course, looking at this collection of dots, you probably should be thinking about how in the world do we study this in a reductionist manner? How do we break it down network by network and isolate the network so that we could actually be able to tell whether a certain type of musical stimulus or rhythmic stimulus is impacting one network in a separable way from the other. So therein lies the promise of music-based interventions in the brain, but also the challenge. So different types of pathways that are impacted, just to quickly go through. Of course, there's the basic auditory pathway in order to perceive the basic acoustic features of music. What you're looking at here are sideways views, sagittal views, a right hemisphere depicted here on the left-hand side, and then a mid-sagittal view. Imagine the brain sliced down the middle. You're looking at the side. Lots of kind of basal areas in and around the brain stem, deep centers of the brain affected, as well as the outer core, the cortex. So you have the basic auditory pathway in green. I won't spend too much time on that because it's not unique. This is how all incoming sounds ultimately are processed at the level of the auditory cortex, the inferior colliculus, and so on. Then you have a more distributed network in turquoise with musical syntax perception. And this is a network that's made to perceive higher order musical features, pitch variability, and things like that. The other thing I will mention, just as an aside here, I often get asked how lateralized is music processing in the brain? And the answer is it kind of depends on how you look at it. Much of musical processing is actually bilateral. Pitch processing does tend to be mostly in the right hemisphere, however. And the key area for the musical syntactic network is the planum temporale, the temporal plane, which is kind of embedded within the Wernicke's area for speech comprehension. And this overlap is important to emphasize because when we're thinking about speech rehabilitation after a stroke, a gunshot wound, traumatic brain injury, a form of music-based intervention called melodic intonation therapy, or MIT, can be very effective. And partly, part of the reason why it could be so effective is because this planum temporale is embedded close to within Wernicke's area, but it could be spared in the event of a stroke or another process that knocks out language processing. And so you could use music and rhythm as a way to rehabilitate, among other things, language. Just to quickly touch upon the other collections of circles here, you have in pink, the attention and working memory network. You need to focus and keep track of music and time. And those of us who are serious amateur musicians or professional musicians or composers are very used to this. It's second nature. And this kind of attention and working memory training can serve us in good stead as a way to build cognitive reserve and impact on the progression of Parkinson's disease and other illnesses that affect this network. Of course, in purple, you have the episodic memory network, recognizing musical patterns, melodies, and recalling any associated memories. This, of course, is the network that's devastated in Alzheimer's disease. And in part, because music activates this network powerfully, we think that we could really impact the course of Alzheimer's disease through repeated exposure to music. Then in blue, dark blue circles, you have the motor network. They also show the somatosensory network here. Of course, this is going to be activated most powerfully when somebody's actually playing an instrument or singing. But I will tell you that especially for trained musicians who are passively listening to music, their passive listening is more active than for folks who are not trained musicians. Their brain responses are really quite different. And partly the way they're different is that they have more powerful activation of some regions of this motor and integrated somatosensory network. So playing, singing, moving, grooving to the beat of music involves the motor network and its interplay with the somatosensory network as well. And then last but not least, a lot of orange circles on the right-hand side are those deep nuclei. We have the ventral tegmental area, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, which is sometimes called the pleasure center in the brain, amygdala, center for fight or flight responses. These are all part of the reward and emotional processing network that could be powerfully activated by music. But again, I take a bit of an issue with the way that this figure depicts it. It says reward and emotional network, music evoked emotions and experience of pleasure and reward. Well, by and large, yes. When we're thinking of music-based interventions, we want to have people experience pleasure and reward. But we have to be careful because depending on the type of stimulus and the person's own circumstances, their memories that are linked to the particular music, coming back to the example I gave when talking about the prior slide in HPA axis, one size does not fit all. In the same exact song, the same snippets of music can lead to diametrically opposite responses in this reward and emotional network. So powerful amygdala activation in the person who's bitterly divorced and hearing that song they danced to at the beginning, and powerful nucleus accumbens activation with dopamine release for the person who's happily married 10 years in. So I think I'll skip this in the interest of time. I'll just quickly talk about the opera hypothesis, which I think is foundational, put forth by Ani Patel from USC. And here he focuses on the possibilities of music to rehabilitate speech. So that's the example I gave about, somebody having a gunshot wound, traumatic brain injury, or stroke that impacts the areas processing speech. And the fact that music processing and speech processing have overlap, that's the initial part of this acronym, OPERA, O-P-E-R-A, which is part of the rehabilitative potential. So there's anatomical overlap between the brain networks that process acoustic features for both music and speech, like amplitude, waveform periodicity. P stands for precision. Music places, on average, greater demands on these shared networks than does speech in terms of the precision timing, temporal processing. And I should say that this is talking about speech, but I think that this conceptually applies to other modalities that we're trying to rehabilitate using music and rhythm, not just speech, okay? So O stands for overlap, P stands for precision, E stands for emotion. As I mentioned in the prior slide, musical activities that engage these shared networks can elicit strong positive emotion. But again, my corollary here is or strong negative emotion. So we have to be careful with the selection of stimuli. R stands for repetition. The musical activities that engage these shared networks need to be frequently repeated. That's the practice makes perfect, practice makes better, 10,000-hour rule for expertise. And A stands for attention. The musical activities that engage these shared networks need to be associated with focused attention in order to maximize the reward. I'll just say on a historical note, this idea of musical exposure leading to lasting changes that we could perceive in the brain is not new. One of the founders, the fathers of modern neuroscience, Santiago Ramón de Cajal, wrote in 1904. This is a quote. Everybody knows that the ability of a pianist to play an adaptation to a new work requires many years of mental and muscular gymnastics. To understand this important phenomenon, it's necessary to accept that in addition to the reinforcement of pre-established organic pathways, new pathways are created by the ramification, that is branching, and progressive growth of terminal dendritic and axonal processes. The point here is that Santiago Ramón de Cajal worked with a microscope, and he wrote this decades before the advent of electroencephalography, computed tomography, and MRI. And this is what he postulated. So the point is that now we actually have a way of looking at it using functional, structural, MRI, magnetoencephalography, EEG, and so on. I'm just skipping this in the interest of time. And now we can actually evaluate this objectively and quantitatively. So in terms of Parkinson's disease, to give you a particular example, this is what our center has been largely focusing on until recently. The idea is to use therapeutic music performance or singing to improve gross as well as fine motor skills via this concept of rhythmic entrainment. The definition is simple. Rhythmic entrainment is just patterning of our body's processes and movements to the rhythm of music. So that's both internal patterning, so changes in heart rate, changes in blood pressure, and changes in electroencephalography, which I'll show you in the next slide, and plus or minus external patterning. So think about a concert. The last time you went to a concert, maybe you were at Madison Square Garden, some large arena, and the people on stage wanted to ask the audience to clap along. How long does it take for the audience to get in sync? Well, curiously, it doesn't much matter whether it's an audience of 50, 500, 5,000, or 50,000. It takes seconds. So the concept behind why it takes such a short time for people to get in sync with each other is rhythmic entrainment. And in Parkinson's disease, this concept can be used to either strengthen or get around faulty pathways that are constantly being remodeled in the brain. And so, did it freeze on me? No, we're good. I'll switch this. I'll just show you this slide and then I'll stop talking. This is in healthy people, a really neat study from neuroscience by Sylvie Nazard and colleagues from 2012, looking at the electroencephalography frequency spectrum in response to pure tones that were just given as different rhythms. So hertz is, of course, cycles per second. And at the top here in this one of the experiments, you have the actual frequency of the sounds that people were hearing through headphones. And then the EEG spectrum was averaged across the right and left hemisphere, centrotemporal leads, for those who are interested. And they were just simply looking to match up if the amplitude and the power spectral density is how it's matching up to the different frequencies that are being heard. So this is, again, in healthy people, not in people with PD, but you have different frequencies. So you have 1.25 hertz, for example, over here. And then on the EEG spectrum, this is time locked. You have right underneath it 1.25 hertz as the largest discernible average peak on EEG. So what do you have here? Of course, we're talking about millions of neurons firing together, but this is exactly lined up to the frequency that is being heard through the ear. Then you go to 2.5 hertz. You see exactly the same thing. You go to 5 hertz. This other experiment, you see the same peak, which is discernible. What's arguably more interesting, though, is this idea of harmonics resonance. For musicians, of course, you guys are thinking, what is he talking about? So you have multiples, mathematical multiples that are actually perceived as distinct EEG peaks. They're smaller, but they're still clearly there. 2.5 hertz and even 5 hertz here. Over here, the 2.5 hertz was the main frequency that was administered. You have 5 hertz and 10 hertz. And then when you have the 5 hertz sound, you have 10 hertz and even tiny bit, you could really have to squint at 20 hertz frequency perceived as well. So what does that mean? There are different ways that we could potentially interpret this, but I think what this is demonstrating is the brain practically in real time is generating rhythmic expectation because of this. So there's a certain expectation of what, not just what, but when the beat is going to come next. And a lot of music psychology, at least this is going back to my undergrad classes at Penn, is about setting up that expectation musically and then either fulfilling the expectation or frustrating the expectation. And this, of course, takes place both on the melodic level, harmonic level, and on the rhythmic level. So I will stop there and look forward to the subsequent presentation and discussion. Thank you.
Was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that the audience will have a lot of questions. Thanks, Alex, for leading that part. And I think we can switch gears to our musicians here. Reiko and Thomas, take it away.
All right. Can everyone see the slides?
We can.
Thanks so much for having us. Reiko and I are so excited to be here. And today we're going to talk a lot about time. So the reason we wanted to talk about time and what I'm going to talk about here a little bit is why time is so important to musicians and specifically to composers. So music is a really specific art form because perceiving music involves perceiving time. And that is really distinct from something like visual art, where the entire artwork is viewable at once. So there's a painting on the wall. You can see the left side. You can see a figure over to the right. You can see an object somewhere else. You perceive the entire artwork at once, and you can constantly reference all parts of the artwork. And music is very different from that because it requires an outlay of time on the listener's part to experience the work and to perceive it. Music also relies on memory. So, like I said, where you can reference in visual art all parts of the artwork at once, in music, you have to remember what you heard in the first measure, in the first minute, even in the first hour. So Reiko and I are composers, and one of the main things we have to deal with when we're creating a piece of music is what we're going to do with time. So that includes our own perception as composers, the perception of the performers that are realizing the music, and the perception of the audience who we're asking to sit there and listen to the piece of music, whether it's a minute long and 10 minutes long or an hour long. I wanted to mention that Reiko and I are specifically talking about what's referred to as art music or concert music. So there is music that composers work with that a lot of people are familiar with for TV and film. That kind of composition has really specific constraints that are given to the composer. For example, we need music for 28 seconds. It needs to be for this event. It needs to sound like this, and it's supporting another visual art form, something like that. There's also very specific expectations for genre with that kind of composition. With what Reiko and I are typically working with, concert music or art music is music that's designed to be listened to in a concert hall. So, for example, if you go to an art museum, you're going to the museum specific to view art. The art in the museum is not supporting another art form. It's not background to your experience. You're there to view art. And so the kind of music that Reiko and I create is music that's not intended to be background to another art form, but it's something that you specifically go to listen to. So some of the things we're thinking of when we go to write a new piece of music is how we're going to work with time. So, like I said, with film or television music, it's that time is often dictated by other factors. But if you're creating a new piece of music, it can be anywhere from a few seconds long to hours long. There are many operas that are 3, 4 hours long, and there are several pieces that are less than a minute even. So you have a wide range of decisions that you can make. And then within that overall duration, you have to make decisions about how that time is going to be divided, both in a chronological sense, how many seconds or minutes is each section going to last, versus the perceived time. So does this 1 second feel much longer to the audience than the 10 minutes before it, for example? And Reiko is going to talk a little bit later about the difference there. And then also, how are your expectations with time going to be reinforced or subverted? So composers have a lot of tools available to them, like harmony or rhythm or repetition, that set up expectations in the audience regarding time or the duration of a piece. So certain harmonic functions will imply the end of a section, the end of a phrase, the end of the piece. And the same goes for rhythm and repetition as well. So we have to decide, are we going to use those tools to give the audience some sort of indicator of what's going to happen next in the time of the piece, or are we going to use those tools to subvert that expectation? So I will pass it over to Reiko.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And thank you very much, everyone, for having us. I wanted to continue what Thomas just talked about and give some specific examples, but also put this into a larger and primarily cultural context. This context would have to be a Western context. That's the only one that I feel qualified to talk about. But also, since we create music specifically in a primarily Western context, I think that would be a perspective that actually makes sense. And I wanted to read 2 quotes that put this into a specific understanding in terms of the culture that we're talking about, meaning primarily what does music mean and what does the creation of music mean. I wanted to start with the first quote, which is from the book of Genesis, that talks about the creation of the world according to that very specific culture. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth was unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a first day. So what's really fascinating about this quote to me is that according to the Old Testament, the beginning of the creation was actually the act of creating time by separating light from darkness and creating the first day. God literally created time. But how did God create time according to that specific culture? Through separation. So the idea of a division becoming a creative act to create something is ingrained into that very specific culture. The second one is from Plato and actually Aristotle. And he said, since the forms were the causes of all other things, he, Plato, thought the elements were the elements of all things. As matter, the great and the small were principles. As essential reality, the one, for from the great and the small, by participation in the one, come the numbers. These 2 quotes are connected because if we create a division, then we have to also create division based on very specific principles. And these principles, according to the Western cultures, were always based on the principle of numbers. So here's a specific example. Thomas, if you could please go to the next slide. In the early 1400s, the composer Guillaume Dufay wrote a piece, a motet called Nuper Rosarum Floris for the consecration of the cathedral in Florence. The motet is based on a Gregorian chant, but it is specifically divided into 4 sections. Can we please go to the next slide? So the 4 sections are divided into smaller units. And what's really interesting about this piece is that the units in which the 4 main sections are divided into is twofold. The first one is what we refer to as a measure. A measure is indicated in the score with a vertical line. And that kind of notation, which is very specific for the Western tradition of music, creates then a constant division of the piece into smaller units. Each of those 4 sections have exactly 28 measures, which creates a proportion of 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 among those 4 main sections. However, the measure in each of those sections, the duration of each measure is actually different, which means if we have a smallest unit, then the first section lasts a total of 84 units, the second one 56, the next one 28, and the last one 42, which creates therefore a different kind of proportion, and that's the proportion of 6 to 4 to 2 to 3. What's really interesting about this piece, and also quite representative, is that we have a visual proportion, which is a 1 to 1 to 1 proportion, and the 1 to 1 to 1 proportion was considered to be the simplest and therefore most perfect, because God, when he created time at the beginning in the book of Genesis, divides the time of the day, 24 hours, into 12 hours of night and also into 12 hours of day. But in terms of the actual experience of those 4 different sections, the proportions are different. So what we see and what we hear is not the same thing. Now, these proportions can be found in the Florence Cathedral, and they are referenced to the Book of Kings, because the temple built by Solomon, according to the description in the Book of Kings, has also a proportion of 6 to 4 to 2 to 3. So music was considered to be a kind of architecture, which means that we are experiencing time that's divided into sections, which express very specific proportions, which in themselves are actually representative of an extra musical idea. In that specific regard here, the proportions of a building. Now, what's really fascinating for me is of course, the question then quickly arises if that's actually possible to perceive. And the answer is quite clearly it is not. Large-scale proportions cannot be perceived, but there was always the essence of the understanding of what the work of art represents within the Western context, that the most important aspect of the artistic idea is that we have the awareness of it existing, not actually a experience of our senses. But it comes to something different. Thomas, can we please go to the next slide, which is that according to Greek mythology, there were always 2 different ways of experiencing time. One of them was represented by Chronos, and that's the idea of chronological linear time. We can quantitatively measure time, but then there's also Kairos, and that's the idea of how we actually experience time, what kind of quality of time we're experiencing, and not only what kind of quantity of time we're experiencing. So the idea of dividing amount of time into proportions is a chronological act. How we actually experience these proportions is something entirely different. And those 2 experiences are usually not the same. That's why in the Western context, music as an experience, as sound, but also music as notation, are 2 different ideas of expressing musical ideas, which are not necessarily congruent. The second aspect that I quickly wanted to point at has to do with a piece by Igor Stravinsky. It was written in the beginning of the 20th century, and there are 3 short pieces for string quartet. I did an analysis of the piece, which basically disregards every single musical aspect except for the one of form. Thomas, can we please go to the next slide? We're going to listen to this in just a second, so maybe we can go back to this, Thomas. For now, let's move on and talk about quickly the form of the piece which you see here. So I took the alphabet as an indication of a musical identity as it's introduced in a linear way. The Greek alphabet is fascinating in that it was the first alphabet that represented a linear structure, meaning in the very beginning, letters A, B, C also represented numbers 1, 2, 3. If I now reduce the entire piece to a form by simply indicating musical identities, I end up with a succession of letters that you see behind form. Now, an interpretation of that would to group these letters together. And I group these into three different groups. They're basically based on the idea of both presence and absence. So the first group in the first division includes letters A, B, C, D, E, but it does not include any subsequent letters. The second group, which I then designated as B, includes letters F, G, and so forth, but it doesn't include letters A, B, C, D, E. And the last group then again includes the letters A, B, C, D, E, but not the ones in the middle. So by doing that, I actually have the possibility of generating a sense of form, which then creates large-scale division of the entire piece. What's really fascinating about this is that the classical musical idea usually keeps things in the order in which they were introduced when something is being recapitulated. So in a classical sonata form, in the recapitulation, the ideas are being repeated in their specific order. What Stravinsky does is that when the elements of the first section are repeated at the end, they are represented in a different order. And that means that my process of recollection or memory, which Thomas mentioned earlier, is actually being challenged. Usually, any kind of recollection is a recollection in a linear order. And if that's not created or possible, then the elements start to take on a different kind of identity. And that results in the transcendence of time. Thomas, could we go back and listen to that movement to simply get a little oral experience of what that sounds like? The music does rely on our memory. We do recognize certain ideas when they come back, and that allows us to establish a relationship with the first time we heard this, what's different, how long ago did it happen, and so forth and so forth. But at the same time, our memory is also based on the succession of ideas, not only specific ideas. So if that succession is then being challenged, our experience becomes a very different one. And that's usually considered as being a psychological way of listening to music. That this kind of formal approach, which does not follow the classical approach of always recapitulating something in order, started at the end of the 19th century. I don't think it's a surprise. But it also then relates to what we've talked earlier when we talked about the idea of Renaissance music, that there is a difference between what we can detect when we look at a score and what we actually experience. And the idea of processing the information that is being transmitted, either when we read a score or when we listen to a piece of music, is then a different experience and therefore complex at the same time. Thomas, do you have a closing remark?
I think that's all for me, but I know we wanted to save some time for questions here at the end.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Right.
I was just
Oh, go
saying
ahead.
thank you so
Yeah.
much, but A will take us away with the Q&A. I'm really curious to hear all of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your amazing talk. So you have all like share all these like music and things, but I'm really curious. Do you have any thing to share? As you both are composers, do you have any like favorite art or music that you have composed? And why is it your most favorite one? There might be like some sort of stories or interesting things. Maybe you can even share, the music or that you have already composed or something if you can share that might be really great.
Thomas, why don't you go first?
Sure. Um, it's really difficult. I think your perception of your own music changes constantly, and I think a lot of composers would relate to being very critical of their own work. Um, so genuinely, my favorite piece is typically the one I'm working on at the time. But there is one that I think the group might find interesting, and I'd be happy to share a link to it after we finish up tonight. But I did a piece of music as part of my thesis for my master's degree. It was a piece for full orchestra and three vocalists, and every piece of musical material in the entire work was a reference to something else or was directly quoted from something else. I'd never really done anything like that before, and I haven't done anything exactly like that since. So that one is one of my favorites.
Thank
Um,
you.
it's a beautiful question and maybe a little difficult to answer, but the older I get, the more I feel that composing, the act of composing, but then listening to the music that you have composed, they're very, very different. And the older I get, the more I actually enjoy the act of composing. And it seems to become more and more the focus, as if it's not about a product, which is what we refer to as the idea of the work, but it's more the practice of what you're actually doing. Because you can live entirely in your imagination. Once you realize anything, there's of course practical concerns, and they will always be different, and that's necessary as much as it's also enjoyable and fun. But that kind of freedom that one has when one lives entirely in one's imagination, I think is extremely special and precious, and becomes somehow more and more important for me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I have seen a lot of like videos in YouTube, like Reiko videos. I think I love all of the music that you have created. So I'm also a pianist, so I really love music.
That's
Uh,
wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, so also for Alex, that was an amazing talk. I'm also in neurology training back in Baltimore. And so I'm all interested in all about like Parkinson's and music. So you have talked applying music in like improving the motor symptoms in the Parkinson's disease. What about like there are a lot of non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease where you can um, apply music to improve. So do you have any thoughts or idea about like implying that?
Yes, I didn't have a chance to mention this up front, but thank you for this great question. When I was talking about the concept of rhythmic entrainment, it's mostly been studied in terms of the rhythmic organization, like the EEG pattern organization that I showed in that one paper. But increasingly, attention is being paid to the emotional network aspects of this. So if you remember that the emotional network involving some of those deep centers, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, that can be powerfully engaged simultaneously, the same time that somebody is getting entrained. And so colloquially, that's often referred to as groove, getting into the groove of music. And that again could be actually next thing you know, you're listening to a piece you really like, and you're tapping along to the beat or you're clapping along, and you're not even necessarily conscious of it up front. But even if you're not doing that, you could still have a powerful emotional response as you are going through the rhythmic entrainment component. And I think that's very important to highlight because this involves dopamine release, which in the case of Parkinson's disease, of course, is an important part of the deficiency. There's an ongoing loss of dopamine making cells in the midbrain. And something that elicits dopamine generally can make you feel better. Dopamine, dope, that's where that connection comes from originally to drugs of abuse. Those drugs of abuse impact this emotional processing network, including the nucleus accumbens, very powerfully. And if we're appropriate and careful and individualized in our selection of musical stimuli, we could powerfully activate the network in a similar way to what drugs of abuse do. And I say that with intent because if music can in fact be similarly addictive, then you could see how people will keep coming back to the context that in which they're hearing that music. So if it's exercise, in the case of Parkinson's disease, exercise has the strongest evidence base for slowing down the progression of disease. We don't have a pill approved by the FDA for that yet, but exercise clearly is it, 150 minutes per week. How do you get people to exercise in a repetitive way and keep engaging? Part of the solution is music. Not for everybody, and certainly not the same music, but that's part of the solution. And in terms of our own studies that we've done and what's been published, in fact, the most powerful effects in Parkinson's disease and related disorders are non-motor, to your question. Um, Improvement in mood and reduction in anxiety, along with overall quality of life, self-reported quality of life improvements are what study after study has been demonstrating.
Thank you. I'm sure music can be implied in all sorts of form. Um, do we also have any questions, comment, or check box? Okay, so there's one. Like, how do you think musicians or composers can use this science to create pieces that can attract or impact a specific population?
Guess I could take an initial stab at that, but I really want to know what other uh, folks think, Reiko and Thomas think. Um, I think that a preliminary question that should be posed before that, and this is inspired by what I just heard from Thomas and Reiko, is should musicians and composers, in fact, use this science to create pieces that can attract or impact a specific population? I think that would be the first question in my mind. I dabbled in composition when I was a preteen. Don't pretend that I was any good at it, but it's certainly something I've thought about a bit. I'm not sure. I mean, I really want to turn that question over to you guys. And in my mind, it also links in with a growing interest in AI composed music. I'm aware that in China, they're doing a ton of work on this. The Beijing Central Conservatory invited me to give a talk on this, and that's how I came to learn a few years ago that they are really actively working in this area. For me, it smacks of the impersonal, computerized, kind of the antithesis of the context for our discussion here, neurohumanities, right? Music as part of the neurohumanities. So, I want to express my reservations and concern about this methodological approach, where we are in a sense treated, our brains, if you will, are treated as an automaton, and you have this prescription that you have to find for everybody. That's part of the equation. The other aspect of the equation is if you're a human composer and you're trying to find the individualized approach, even if you can do that, it's extremely time consuming. I mean, at the minimum, you're going to get standardized questionnaires, which is what we do for our studies, that people fill out that tell you about their top 10 songs, about their genres preference. And it doesn't stop there because they may think that that's their genre of preference, but maybe there's something for their brain that they haven't yet experienced. And they should, because that's going to unlock something even more powerful within them. Let me stop talking and get input from Thomas and Reiko.
I think it's such an interesting question because I think I'm sure it would be quite possible to create a piece of music that fulfills a very specific purpose. If a composer was told, we need this kind of rhythm, we need this kind of duration, that could be done very easily. But I think if we're looking for music that is actually impactful on an emotional level to a specific population of people, it gets a lot more difficult because a lot of art making and a lot of creating art that's impactful and enjoyable to people involves doing something that's unexpected or doing something that's controversial or doing something that people initially don't like but then fall in love with later. So it's a very difficult question to answer in from the perspective of like making a piece of art.
Yeah, if I could quickly follow up, it's basically an aesthetic question, and research into how music affects us and how it prompts us to do certain kind of things has existed for a long time. Once a company named Muzak was created that creates specifically playlists for public spaces such as shopping malls and so forth and so forth. That it created a response among quote unquote art composers because all of a sudden music became a kind of manipulation. That's existed for a very long time, but never to that kind of scientific and commercial degree. And if the essence of art really is to reach into the unknown and also find who we are if we expose ourselves to contexts which we haven't experienced before, then that would kind of go against that idea of how we can specifically create music that would become basically a recipe for how people respond to it, because I think that's exactly what composers of art do not want. They want the opposite.
Yes, that's amazing. There's also one fan question. What do you think of the impact of music on driving? I see some people lower the volume when they are trying to park or focus on something. So, what do you guys think?
Oh, you can only do one thing. You can either drive or listen to music. Once you focus on parking and not paying attention to the music anymore, it's distracting. In my experience, it's hard to do both. When I go to a ballet, I find myself either watching and not listening or listening and not watching. I think they kind of contradict each other, but the idea, and again, it's what kind of experience are we looking for? The German composer Helmut Lachmann said that we're looking for an existential experience. And that means that it touches us in a very deep kind of way that takes us out of ordinary activities and puts us in a state of awe. So it cannot be a secondary experience in that regard. And that's what happened in classical music with Beethoven, that it refused to be a service as it was always considered to be. And it's an experience that you engage with 100% in order to really make it a human experience in that regard. So I would advise against it. Otherwise, you might have a bump in your car.
Yeah, I'm for sure. All right, thank you all. Thank you for this amazing talk. I'm sure there are still a lot of questions coming up. But in terms of like respecting or other times, Matthew or Davika, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I think Devika will take it away, but Again, thank you all for this fascinating discussion. You see that there were so many more questions, so we're gonna have to have a part two, but this was really a fascinating experience. Thank you to all three of you for this.
Thanks for
Hi,
having me. It's wonderful.
Devika, take it away.
hi everybody. I'm Devika. I'm a third-year medical student and a part of NHN. I work on the newsletters that you see every month. First, I would like to thank all three speakers for the fascinating information you shared with us tonight. I'll definitely be sharing it with my friends tomorrow. In terms of announcements, today we have an exciting event coming up soon, our very first NHN book club. So please join us as we discuss Priya Anand's The Mind Electric with the author herself on August 5th from 8 to 9 p.m. So please order your copy today and join us as we're very excited. I've started reading the book myself, and it's been very interesting and fascinating so far. So highly recommend. Next slide, please. And then after the book club event, we have another talk coming up called What Parkinson's Disease Looks Like Through the Art by Barbara Salzberg Matthews. And that's going to be on August 27th from 8 to 9 p.m. And I'm hoping to send out a newsletter soon, which will have all the links to register for these events and the amazing website that Rida and I have made and maintained will also have links to register to the events. Lastly, we are looking for a social media intern to join the team. So if you're interested and have experience with social media, please reach out to us and email us at neurohumanitiesnetwork@gmail.com with your name, current title, social media experience, and specifics about your interest in joining our team. And looking forward to reading all entries. Any other inputs from the team?
No, I think that's it. Wonderfully said, and thank you for this wonderful talk, and have a good night.